to start with your ascension to television, and then we're going to ascend to TV in Buffalo. And what was
Well, guys in radio would feel bad that you said that, you know, that I ascended to television.
What was the market like when you hit with a 15-minute newscast, right, initially?
Yeah.
Let's start with that.
Okay.
What was it like?
What was the market like when we did our first 15-minute newscast? Well, pretty much the way it is now. Channel 4 dominated the market. They were the first station on the air. They did surveys, found that people out in the rural areas who had TV sets that would get 3 or 4 channels, they didn't know there were any other channels. It was tuned to 4, and they thought that was it, and they were happy.
So what did you have to do to become a presence?
Well, we had virtually no promotion at the station. The owners at that time, which were Dr. Clinton H. Churchill, and his son was a manager of the station, they felt that it was pointless putting money into it, because in a 3-station market at that time, we were number 4. It was pitiful. And they only did news to hang commercials there and to keep their license. So virtually we had no visibility at all. And so whatever audience we were going to attract, the people on the air had to do it through their own personalities or through the product itself.
When did you formulate your approach? Was it something conscious? Scott up at all? No. Is there? Okay. So, Irv, picking up where we left off, it's up to the talent to do something.
Such as it was.
Yeah, to do something where, and you don't want to play with this because there's going to be
okay.
It's going to be a thunderstorm. It's up to the talent to do something. So, how did you invent eyewitness news the way you presented it? Where did you come up with the formula to steal the audience from 4?
Well, it was not a simple process. It took us about 7 years to go from number 3 to number 1. I realized early in the game that if we did the same type of news program as channels 4 and 2, we weren't going anywhere. We had to define ourselves as being a different news program. Part of that was related to the chemistry between Rick Azar, Tom Jones, and myself. And the other part was in the approach to writing the story. And that is, in addition to the who, what, where, when, and why of the story, some of the emotional sense of what you were talking about. There were people who shall remain nameless that were on the air then, and there are people who are on the air now, not necessarily locally, but nationally as well, who will go from a story about war and death and famine and swine flu directly into a story about a skateboarding bulldog with no transition at all. No indication that it's a different type of story. In point of fact, there is a network anchor person who oftentimes goes from a story about the president to a story about rice farming in China with the word meanwhile in between those two stories. And first-year journalism students know that you say meanwhile when the second story is related in some way to the first story. So this has not occurred to anyone at the network.
So you come up with really something unique, not only in Buffalo, unique in the country, and perhaps in the world, in a sense. Where did you find that style? Where did you come up with the alliterations that have stayed to this day as legend in the city of Buffalo?
Well, I started out, not right after I was born, but after I grew up, with a desire to have a life on the stage, or screen, or radio. I was interested in theater, and I did quite a bit of theater, non-professional, and when at the point it became obvious that the world was not waiting for a short, facially challenged kid for a starring role in an MGM musical, that I had to change direction. I had actually started in radio at WHAM in Rochester, New York, as a boy actor, and that was perhaps the most thrilling and glamorous part of my entire life in broadcasting. My gosh, I would see these announcers who would go into the booth once or twice an hour dressed in a suit, shirt, and tie, and deliver into the microphone the call letters of the station, and that's pretty much all they did. And they were making tremendous salaries, and it convinced me at that time that this is a profession that I would want to pursue.
Was it the money, opportunity, or a chance to draw on what you had to bring to?
Yeah, it wasn't the money. I would have paid for the opportunity to do that.
Well, what were you doing as a child actor on the radio?
WHAM, which was one of the most prestigious radio stations in the country, 50,000 watt clear channel, owned by Stromberg Carlson, a pioneer in radio. They had, and we're talking in the mid-40s, they had a palatial station compared to most of the other stations, which included a studio that would hold 200-300 people. There was a stage, a raised stage. There was a control room off of the stage. They had a studio orchestra. And it was just, there was a chief announcer at WHAM at the time, a fellow by the name of Bill Hanrahan, who someone told me he was leaving to go to NBC. And I'm thinking to myself, guy must be crazy. Why would he leave a great job like this to go to NBC? That was my serious thought. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bill Hanrahan. He went on to become one of the stars of NBC radio staff and did the introductions for a lot of their, later on, their television shows, and even did some movies.
Well, what were you doing, though? What kind of work?
Well, they would call me up, and they would say, we've got a part for a state trooper in a series called True Stories of the New York State Police, strange as it may seem. And because my vocal equipment was pretty well developed even at the age of 15, 16, I could play adults. I would play a state trooper or a bank robber or a farmer in Weedsport, directing the police to the scene of a crime.
Give me an example. You're on the radio right now. Just a line or two. How would you deliver it, or what would you say in those days?
Well, whatever the script called for. I can't remember, offhand
Well, you,
what that would be.
so you would play the prototype of a cop,
Yeah.
which would be
Yeah.
what, rough or gruff? Or
A little gruff, but professional. Farmer, obviously, like the farmer in Fargo, the movie. And then I also did skits that were part of a program called the WHAM Junior Players, which is why I got hired originally, because I answered an ad for teenagers to take part in radio programs. And that was basically comedy skits.
what kind of comedy would?
Well, similar to the stuff you see on sitcoms, except instead of half-hour programs, they would be 5-minute, 7-minute sketches. And the fellow who wrote and directed them, a fellow by the name of Jim Traherne, he was a genius. He was a real genius. He would be writing the scripts almost right up to airtime, papers flying in the air, and as I say, it was just it was thrilling to be a part of that. Possibly the apogee of my career at WHAM Radio was when they brought down some of the network shows. They had done some remodeling at the station, and one of the shows they brought down to originate in Rochester was the Henry Aldrich Show, which was a radio sitcom. Henry Aldrich being supposed to be a 17, 18-year-old kid, mom and dad, Aldrich, and the actor was in fact about 45 years old, an actor by the name of Ezra Stone. Anyway, my part was, it was 4 words. I was the ace cleaner's boy, and you hear the screen door open, and I scream up into the house, "Ace cleaners, Mrs. Aldrich." And she says, "They're in the closet, Harry." And that was it. Now, this was pre-audio tape for those shows. They did 2 shows live, one for the East Coast and one for the West Coast. Well, I was fine on the East Coast show. On the West Coast show, 3 hours later, I blew one of the words, which has embarrassed me my entire professional life.
What was it?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. It was one of those 4 words. Maybe it was cleaners. I don't know. That would have been a difficult word for me at that stage. And
You never forgot that one.
never forgot it. Those are things that happen in your career that are of such an embarrassing level that you never forget it.
Any repercussions from it?
No.
Nobody.
No. Now, about a month later, nobody ever mentioned salary or anything. And that was fine. I just thought they needed me for this bit part in the show, and that was good. And about a month later, I get a letter from NBC. It's an NBC envelope, and thank you for taking part in the production of that segment of the Henry Aldrich Show. And it was a check for $230. Well, again, if there was any question in my mind, $230 for 4 words. Someone pointed out to me years later in a similar interview that Winston Churchill wasn't making that much money for his speeches. But it was great. So I had a great time.
What was the transition then to Buffalo?
Well, there was a lot of space between that time and when I came to Buffalo. When I got out of school, I thought that, the natural thing was I had worked 2-3 years at Wham, and that perhaps there might be a job there. The chief announcer interviewed me. I'd known the guy, I met him, and advised me that radio probably wasn't the vehicle for my any future career.
Why?
Well, he never explained. Never explained.
He didn't think you made the grade?
He didn't think I was right for radio.
Was
Yeah.
Was your voice different then? Did you have a different delivery? I mean,
No,
Irv Weinstein?
no, it never was that.
He had the pipes.
Yeah, I had, the vocal power was pretty much there. So there followed several years when I worked part-time at radio stations, DJs, fill in for vacations, stuff like that. Odd jobs, worked as a furniture store salesman. At one point, well, everybody has, almost everybody has a career like that unless their father owns the station or the network. I went to, I was into my 20s when I went to a broadcast school in New York City, School of Radio and Television Technique. And I thought to myself, growing up in a middle-class Jewish home, that probably maybe acting wasn't that, maybe I'd better do something more practical. Also in the interim, let me backtrack a little. Right out of high school, I went out to Hollywood to break into the movies. I knew you'd enjoy that. And the closest I got to being in the movies was at the Pantages movie theater on Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles, watching Kirk Douglas up on the screen in the movie Champion, which was a heck of a good movie. And I...
What made you think you were going to just walk into Hollywood and...
Well, I didn't think I would just walk in and they would sign me right up to a long-term contract, but I thought that, if they gave me an audition, if there was, I didn't have a clue.
How'd you get out there?
I didn't have a clue. By train. It was a 2.5-hour trip by train.
2.5 days?
2.5 days, yeah, I'm sorry, 2.5 days. Train from Rochester to Chicago, and then on the Empire State Limited, changed in Chicago to a Santa Fe Railroad. And
you were alone?
And I was alone, yeah, I was alone. I had never been away from home.
Any money in your wallet?
I had $400, which I had strenuously saved, keeping in the back of my mind, as often happens, there was a buddy of mine in high school, and we were going to go out there together to conquer Hollywood, and he chickened out at the last minute. I decided to go alone.
And how old were you?
Well, I was 18. Yeah, I was an average student, and I was average age for getting out of school.
How long did you last out in Hollywood?
I lasted out there 1.5 years. I met a bartender. No, I wasn't drinking that early, but I met a bartender. The bar was near a place where I had a room, and they served food. Actually, it was free. If you bought a drink, you got a sandwich. And so I had a ginger ale, and I'd have lunch. And I struck up a friendship with the bartender, who had told me that he was, at one time, an assistant director at Columbia Pictures. And as young and unsophisticated as I was, I thought to myself, yeah, right. And, the moon is made of green cheese. But one day he calls me up and he says, Irwin, well, that of course was my name at that time, before I changed it professionally to Irv, he said, Irwin, he said, how would you like to go out to the studio? It's a nice day, and I said, sure. So I put on my bar mitzvah suit, and we went out to Columbia Pictures, go to the front gate. I'm thinking all this time this guy's, he's pulling my chain. Go to the gate, the guard comes out, he says, hey, Art, how you doing? Holy mackerel. I'm thinking to myself, this guy really did. work at Columbia. Go into the studio. We go to a sound stage where they were shooting a Tarzan movie with Lex Barker and Denise Darcel, she of the voluminous top. And Cheetah was on Lex Barker's shoulder and did a doo-doo. So they had to stop the scene. And I'm glowing with pride here. So he introduced me to Lex Barker and Denise Darcel. And he said, I think Bob Mitchum is shooting a film at another soundstage. Bob Mitchum, my God, so we go onto this soundstage, and there's Mitchum and Janet Leigh shooting a scene from a film called Christmas Holiday or something. And I was stunned. They had recreated a part of Central Park on this soundstage. And Art says to me, when they break the scene, we'll go to Bob's trailer and I'll introduce you. Well, you can imagine, what this is for an 18-year-old kid from Rochester, New York. So scene breaks, we go to the trailer, knocks on the door, Mitchum opens the door. Hey, Art, how you doing? Go inside. Art says, Mitch, he said, I'd like to introduce you to this young friend of mine, Irv Weinstein, who's out here, trying to get into the business. Now, Mitchum was probably about 6'5", and I pull myself up to my complete 5'7", maybe 5'7.5" in heels. And he says, good to meet you, Irwin. I put up my hand and say, thanks, Bob. He says, how about a drink? Well, sure. I have a drink every morning at 9 o'clock, to keep myself together. So pours I don't know what it was, gin, vodka, whatever it is, and I'm, taking it very slowly, believe me. Finally, I'm thinking to myself, well, this is the opportunity of my life to talk to a professional and get a real answer. So my voice did rise several octaves when I said to him, hey, Bob, how do you get into this business? And he looks down at me and he said, tell you the truth, he says, I can't tell you. He says, I'm having a hell of a time staying in the business. There's always somebody else climbing up that grease pole behind you. And I thought to myself, well, he's kind of mentally patting me on the head. But, I wasn't angry or anything. This is great. I'll have stories to tell my family, Anyway, we left the studio, and years later, when I really got into broadcasting, and I met some people in the business and had a greater variety of life experiences, I realized that he was being absolutely straight with me. You are never, no matter how big you are, in the movies and radio, television, there's always somebody climbing up that grease pole behind you. You never have total security. And from that time on, Mitchum was one of my real idols, not just as an actor. And incidentally, I think the guy got a raw deal. He was a much better actor than the parts he was offered.
Well, arguably, you were one of those people not in that position in Buffalo because you went out number one on your own terms, and nobody could topple you here. Nobody could climb up that grease pole, even approaching your legs. And that's the
Let me
truth.
tell.
But I want to find out how the transition to Buffalo. It's important to get into that because we could spend a whole
Yeah.
we could spend
No,
days
I know.
and days.
Okay.
Because you've got stories.
Right. Okay.
I want to hit the broadcast end.
My first television job was in Waterloo, Iowa. I took a bus out there for the interview I didn't even get the job offer. I took a bus. I had sent out about 2,000 resumes with audio tapes and things like that, and I got, I think, 3 replies. One was from KWWL-TV in Waterloo. Another one was from some station in Missoula, Montana, and I forget the third station. Anyway, I went out to Waterloo, interviewed, and got the job as a director because I had gone to, in the interim, there was a period, I went to television school. I learned about production and so forth. I wasn't a very good director, to tell you the truth. I was really a lousy director.
Why? What too much
I
going on?
lacked, too much going on. I lacked a digital facility because that's basically what directing in television is, as you know. All you have to do is punch the right buttons and, think very quickly. So after about 3 months, and I was married by this time, incidentally, I got fired, barnstormed across the country from Waterloo, Iowa, all the way to Miami Beach, where my in-laws lived. Of course, where else would they live? And
Not a bad place to
yeah,
be
yeah.
after a while.
And I have to say that my wife, the saint, was very supportive during this difficult time, and I hit every station, big market, small, medium, nothing. I have memories of changing my pants on a road outside of St. Louis for an interview with a big station there. Nothing. Wound up in Miami Beach, sponged off my in-laws for about 3 months, and decided it's not working. We'll go back to Rochester and sponge off my parents. So we went back to Rochester, and I had a couple of jobs. One was as a paint salesman for Sears Roebuck, and after about a month, the supervisor said to me, well, Irwin, you don't seem to have the Sears spirit. And I said, you're absolutely right. And I can't tell you how happy I was to get out of there. I was also offered a job as a permanent at the post office in Rochester. I had worked as a temp. Came back, told Elaine, hey, I could make $125 a week, steady, very secure, so forth. And she said to me, look, she said, that's very nice, but I didn't marry you because I wanted to be married to a post office worker. So I started making contacts, sending out, got a job in Parkersburg, West Virginia, with WTAP, a UHF station. Elaine, at this time, was like 7 months pregnant. Went along with me to Parkersburg. It was raining, and we were looking for an apartment and so forth. Anyway, it was a terrible station, terrible. And again, I was going to be doing directing. I was there 3 months. 3 months seemed to be about the tenure. Little complication here. Elaine had given birth in April 15th, to our son Mark. It was now June, middle of June, and I was fired. And I'm thinking, oh, this is awful. Maybe I'm just in the wrong business. But maybe we'll go back to Rochester, and my mother will have some hot soup and some comforting words. She said, well, why do that? Why not go to a radio station here and see if you can find a job? So I toddle up to the second floor of a building in beautiful downtown Parkersburg to WCEF Radio, named after Clarence E. Franklin, who's the owner, general manager, sales manager, and chief engineer. And he actually has a show on the air called The Friendly Frank Show. Go up there, say, do you have any openings? He said, when can you start? So I said, well, don't you want to audition me? Nah, he says, I know an announcer when I see one. So I'm working at WCEF in Parkersburg. That turned out to be the watershed job of my career. I think they were paying me all of $60 a week. And I was doing news. I had never done news
How old were you?
before that.
Will you
I-
stop for a sec? Okay.
I'm sorry.
Now, just keep your shoulder back.
There you go, okay.
Yeah, how old, where are you? Let's pick up. Where are you? How old are you here?
I was about 27.
And this is the first news.
This is the first time I did news at a station, yeah.
All right. So what happens to your
Okay.
career and to your persona and everything as you develop here?
Sure. It was interesting because this was a daytimer, small station, I think 1,000 watt maybe. And I did news from 9 in the morning. I did news for about 6 hours. And then late in the afternoon, I hosted a music show called Candlelight and Gold. Now, this was a rock and roll station. But for the last 2 hours, they were playing Mantovani and Jan August. You guys are probably too young to remember Jan August. Jan August was a piano player. Little aside, I think it's a wonderful story. The manager of the station slept with a sound thing in his ear so he could monitor the station anytime, even when he was in bed with his girlfriend. And if anything was wrong, he would, jump on his motorcycle and get right down to the station if he wasn't there. Anyway, he was a pretty wild guy. And so I have no idea why he did this, but everybody walked in one day and there's a big notice on the bulletin board. Effective this date, there will never be any piano music on WCF. Now this is a music station,
It was a rocker?
It was a rock, yeah, it was a rock
What year is
station.
this, roughly?
This was 57,
Really?
57.
Very beginning of rock.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Elvis?
It's a top 40 station. And he said, you never want to hear piano music. Anyone breaking this rule will suffer the direst of consequences. He didn't use direst because he didn't know what that meant. But within a day or two, I'm having breakfast at home. Turn on the station, and traditionally, the early morning DJs always are at war with management. And I hear the morning guy say, now folks, some music you've all been requesting. Jan August at the 88 playing Misraloo. Now, this recording probably goes for about 6 minutes, and it's just piano music. I'm listening, and I said, Elaine, I don't believe this. The guy's playing piano music. The manager said, I never want to hear piano music, blah, blah, blah. A few minutes go by. It's in the middle of the music. Suddenly, there's this huge crash, and you can hear the needle skitter across the disc, and then dead silence. And I said, Elaine, I think the station has been attacked. It's an atomic bomb has hit the station. I better go down and see what's going on. So I go down to the station. By the time I get there, the dust has settled, and one of the other guys, I said, what happened? He said, Frank heard this piano music. roared down to the station, ran up the stairs, and the door was locked. The DJ had locked the door. He's banging on the door, and he's saying, "You SOB, open this door now." And the morning guy is laughing hysterically. What he didn't count on was Frank's athletic ability. The guy had hands that reached down to the floor when he was standing upright. He was a real simian. And what he did was that the morning guy had made the fatal error of leaving the transom open. And Frank swung up through the transom and leaped onto him at the turntable, beat the living hell out of it, and threw him down two floors of metal tip stairs. And I tell people, and that's how you get fired in West Virginia. Anyway, I actually was at that station about a year and a half.
You never played August piano music?
No, never. I'm a slow learner, but, that made a big impression on me. And anyway, I loved doing the newscasts. In the interim, from the time I started doing the news, about a week later he announced that I'm the news director. Well, there was no one else there doing news, so I was essentially news director over myself. Able to make policy as the situation,
And you delivered it.
Yeah. And we did a pretty good job.
Anyone under you for news?
No, it was me. I was the news guy. And
Did you cover or just rip and read?
well, there were some instances of some, there was a guy who hung around the station, and he loved radio, and he knocks on my door early one morning, and he said, "The sheriff is rounding up a bunch of people if you want to." So I ran out and I followed it. I forget exactly what it was. I think it was a drug deal. And, my little tape recorder. And, but I really didn't do any outside. I didn't have the time. I had to be there to do the news on the air. So, I was there about a year, I think, and I had continued to send out resumes, and I got an offer from WBOY in Clarksburg, which is about 60 or 70 miles away. Clarksburg being famous for being the birthplace of Stonewall Jackson, General Thomas Jackson. Anyway, I got the job there, and I find myself directing again. Not very good, but, okay. And I got a call from Russ Syracuse, a close friend of mine. He was a DJ, used the name Russ the Moose Syracuse, and he had gotten a job at KB Radio. And he said, "They've got an opening here in the newsroom." I said, "Well, I don't have really a lot of experience." He said, "Well, send him a tape." And the program director was a guy by the name of Dick Lawrence. I sent him a tape, and we exchanged a couple of phone calls, and I was very anxious to get out of West Virginia. There was no way we were going to raise our son in the mountain state. And Buffalo was an ideal market because close to Rochester, family.
What
So
year?
this was 58.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
you knew about Buffalo, right? You'd probably come down.
Oh,
here.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
What was Buffalo like then? And for you to, consider coming to Buffalo, New York, being a little familiar with it, it was a
Sure,
pretty good market,
sure.
right? It was pretty solid.
from the standpoint of where I was at the time, Buffalo was the city on the hill, glowing, you know, a toddling town. Things were really happening in Buffalo. You know, I had gone into Buffalo, you know, from Rochester a couple of times, you know, and was just very impressed, you know. So I get to the station, and this is another one of these broadcast stories that you'll enjoy. I was not supposed to start until Monday, and this is like Friday. But being basically insecure, I thought I would check in. So I check in and I say, the receptionist said yes. I say, hi, I'm Irv Weinstein. I'm here to see Mr. Lawrence. She said, Mr. Lawrence? I said, yeah, the program director. She said, well, he's no longer here. He's no longer with us. I said, what? No longer with you? And my whole life is passing in front of my eyes. Elaine is outside in the parking lot with Mark, with our infant son. All our furniture, possessions are in the car. I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm out of a job. I'm out of a job again.
You quit the other one.
Quit the other job. I left this great job making $75 a week. And here I am. And I started to hyperventilate, I think. I was making noise in any case. And Clint Churchill Jr., the son of the owner, comes out into the hall, and he said, you know, what's happening here? So I explained the situation, you know. Mr. Churchill, Dick Lawrence hired me, and I came here, and I find out he's not working here anymore. He said, well, don't worry. He said, you know, you've got a job. Oh, boy, that was a close one. He said, can you do the next newscast? I said, the next newscast? Certainly. Now, I'm dressed in, you know, jeans, and I'm not prepared for this. But I did the next newscast, and the rest of the newscast, apparently someone had just left, and they desperately needed somebody to fill the slot. So here I am.
How much time between the time you said that and you're on the air?
I would say 10, 15 minutes.
No kidding.
Yeah. Now, at that time, KB Radio had newscasters and news writers, people who wrote the newscasts. So, and the guy that was writing it was Art Wander. Okay? Well, that's enough to make a guy nervous right there. The tiny tot of the kilowatt. And he writes one of these wild stories about an accident where the victim was in this accident, was killed, and the line was, he was whiplashed to death. Well, at that point, I didn't even know my name. And I'm thinking, oh my God, whiplashed to death. So I read it. What was I going to do? I didn't even have a chance to read the copy. So I get off the air, and Churchill calls me into his office. He said, I heard your newscast, he said, and he said it was okay. But he said, you know, this is a top 40 station. He says, you sound too much like Walter Cronkite. I'm thinking to myself, that's a bad thing? It was a bad thing. So
Your style was different.
my style was different, yeah.
It was
It was upbeat, but not what I developed, the on-air persona that I developed, which was basically a top 40 news guy. Fast-paced. Obviously, over time, I developed a writing style that had sizzle and alliteration and the type of thing to grab the audience, because I learned along the way that before you can get people to listen to you, you have to catch their attention. And one way to do that is to in your writing, make it compelling, you know. And sometimes it was overboard, frankly, but it was okay. You know, it was okay. It did the job. And the training I got from Clarence Franklin in Parkersburg at WCEF was writing a newscast every half hour. So I had that facility, and they were doing two newscasts at 15 and 45.
Well, but now, Sizzle and Cronkite are a lot,
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
miles apart. Where did this come from? Did this partly come from the theater background for us, and, for, what were you able to bring?
Absolutely. The theater background had a lot to do with it. I understood what they wanted. They wanted the listeners to barely discern the difference between Russ the Moose Syracuse and Irv Weinstein in terms of basic sound. The pace, very fast paced. So, and that was fine with me. In terms of style, I was sometimes asked who my idol was, in radio, and that was an easy one. It was Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey was not fast-paced, but he had a pace of delivering the news that was compelling. And so I was basically Paul Harvey, but a lot faster. Or at least I like to think I was. I probably wasn't.
How do you, some of the, this might be in the mid-60s or so, but, I can hear in my head Jim Fagan saying, "Death waiting along the side of the road for a pavilion youth this morning." Things like that. As I write news, I can, if I wrote something like "Death waiting along the side of the road."
Yeah,
for a
they would
pavilion,
fire you.
Well, not only that, but I'm thinking of the mother whose son just got ran over by the car listening to this.
Sure.
When you have, and Art Wander talks about that a lot too, the gnashing of metal as they...
Right.
Where do you, how did that come about that it was actually so far out there, the writing?
Well,
that maybe it wasn't, I don't know.
I discerned what they wanted, and I gave them what they wanted, plus. And, I've often been quoted with the line about pistol-packing punks pounded a Polish plumber into the pavement. I never, I'm going to go on record right now, I never, ever said anything like that. Close, but not that phrase. We would do some, frankly, we would do some outrageous stuff.
You're still talking about radio, right?
Yeah, radio. Oh yeah,
But
radio.
Okay. Bring us through those radio.
Okay, sure.
Bring us through those radio days a little more. As you developed, into the '60s, right? Into
Yeah.
the 1960s.
Yeah, early,
What was happening around
late 50s,
KBW?
early 60s.
What was happening around the radio station, and then tell us from that point also how you made that transition to television.
Well, there isn't a great deal to tell. The only notable thing that I recall from that period was when John Kennedy was assassinated. KB radio suddenly went from a top 40 format. It sounded like music coming from a funeral parlor. And everybody, I've been asked, what's the story that affected you most? That's the one that, not just me, but anyone else who was in broadcasting, including Walter Cronkite, who probably came as close to breaking up on the air as, and he was rock solid steel. We were crying, it was just unbelievable. It was terrible. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible time. But as I became better known on the air and off the air, because I would be asked to speak, to various groups, I always enjoyed doing that because I think that if you are a local broadcast journalist, that's part of your job, to become a part of the community. And I always did that, almost from the get-go.
Were people surprised to see you in person, hearing the voice?
Yeah,
Maybe
Yeah.
thinking
Yeah.
this guy's going to be about 6'9",
yeah,
big. And,
yeah. The rabbi who married Beth, our daughter, sent me a note. This was some years, long time before Beth's marriage. When he first met me, he said, you know, he said, you're a very talented young man, he said, and having met you, I was surprised because I always pictured you as a tall, blonde Gentile. He was a funny guy. He was a funny guy. And I forget what I wrote him back, but I wrote him back an equally funny note. Anyway, I think the news was an integral part of KB radio's success. There are a lot of rock stations around, but the thing that really defines a station and gives it some personality, some credibility, if you will, is the news. People hear the news, they trust the newscaster, and KB knocked off WBEN radio. It took a while, because people like Clint Buellman, the morning man, and other people at the station, were really solidly entrenched. So we knocked off the other radio stations. KB was number one across the board, one of the most successful top 40 stations, radio stations in the country.
how did you come
Okay.
back to go to television?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that. In 1964, April of 1964, Elaine and I and our children were vacationing in Miami Beach. We were at a hotel, and one of the hotel people came out and said, a phone call for Mr. Weinstein. It was Bob King, the then general manager of television. He said, Irv, how would you like to pick up your stuff and move across the alley to television? And in fact, as you may know, the building next door was the television station. And I said, great. I said, terrific. That's wonderful. At that point in my career, I was about ready to start looking again because, frankly, I was getting bored doing pretty much the same thing every day.
But yet you were creating these newscasts that were obviously caught on, right? You were the number one station.
Right.
That wasn't enough to keep you from looking elsewhere? I mean,
No.
how could you top that at that point?
Well, we're talking about, I didn't think I could do much more journalistically in radio at that point. So I thought this will be a real challenge. Bill Meeks, who had been the news director at 7, left to go to the Buffalo Evening News. That's what it was called at that time, the Buffalo Evening News, and newspaper. And they needed somebody. And they figured, well, we've got this guy right here. He's next door. Herb Mendelson, who was the manager of KB Radio, wished me good luck. Said, sorry to lose you, but, we're all the same company. By this time, we were owned by Capital Cities Broadcasting. They bought the stations, I think, in 61 or 2. Yeah, 61 or 2.
Now,
And
you didn't fit the typical television persona in looks, in style.
You're-
I mean, you
yeah.
had Chuck Huey.
Yeah,
you had
sure.
Corbett.
John Corbett,
John
yeah.
Corbett. I mean,
Yeah.
had Cronkite on the network. And,
Right, sure.
Huntley Brinkley and
Well, it's funny you should say that. people in the Buffalo broadcast community have sometimes told me that I had a great face for radio. And that's true. If you talk to any of the broadcast consultants, they would not, my name would not come to mind as being an ideal television anchor person. I was short, overweight, had a terminal case of acne. But anyway, having said that, I realized I was taking a leap, from radio, where I was pretty secure, and going into TV that I really didn't know, I knew nothing about the technical aspects of television.
Well, you knew how to direct.
I knew how to direct.
And that was it, right?
And I knew how to put a news program together. And something that a lot of people in broadcasting today don't know. But that's a whole other thing. Well, when I went over, the guy who was anchoring, the anchor for Channel 7 was a guy by the name of Bill Gregory, who, nice presentation, decent looking guy, good pipes, did a good job, read the words well, but that's pretty much all he did. He didn't write anything or do anything. So my job was to write scripts for him, as well as myself, and to co-anchor with Bill on the early newscast. And
What time did you hit the early?
well, I think it was 7. The ratings were so bad that they were afraid of going up against 2 and 4 head to head. So, and at that time in broadcasting, the sales department, to call them salesmen would be to seriously overstate the case. They never left their desks during the day. The phone would ring, somebody would call, do you have a slot, that you could squeeze us in? I mean, it was unbelievable. They were making money faster than they could put it in the bank, which is why Cap Cities bought the stations. Incidentally, Cap Cities paid $14.5 million for both the television and radio stations, which was a record money buy up to that time. And people told them they were crazy. Well, I'll tell you who was crazy. The people who told them they were crazy.
What did they say?
Because they had their money back in about 5 years. And then it was just, because they had, in addition to the local market, they had Canadian money. I think there was $20 million a year coming into the market from Canada. And KB had at least 7 or 8 million
Do you remember what
of
they
that.
sold for?
Oh, not really. No, I don't remember what the spot sold for.
Okay, so you're battling a losing ratings game here at
Right.
7 o'clock. You're not even
Right.
competing with the competition.
True.
And
Terrible.
you got a guy sitting next to you who does
Pitiful.
pretty standard type reading.
Stiff guy. Okay. So we're going along, and I wrote something for him, a story, and he says to me, I'm not going to read that. I said, really? Why not? Bob King wouldn't like it, the manager.
Do you remember what the story was?
No. But it was one of my slightly outrageous stories to catch the audience's attention, and he wasn't going to read it. I said, okay, fine.
What are you feeling up to this time? That
Anger. I'm furious. Who is this so-and-so to tell me I'm writing, I'm the news director, and co-anchor. So I said, fine, that's okay. Don't read it. I'll read it. And then I'll talk to Bob if he objects. After the show, the next day, I marched into the program director's office. Red Cook, good guy. I said, okay, Red, I says, you've got perhaps one of the biggest decisions of your day here. I said, either me or Gregory. He wouldn't read this story. I said, I'm okay with it. I could always get a radio job somewhere. Gregory was gone in a week because they realized they weren't going anywhere with him.
you
And
put
then,
it on the line.
yeah.
And yet you
Yeah.
had a child at home.
I had 2 children.
Two
2 children. 3 children. I had 3 children at that time.
Why
Yeah.
you really felt that
I felt pretty secure. I had a proven record, and Gregory didn't. And so he was gone. He ultimately went to Philadelphia, and he did fine.
you
Yeah.
think it was that story that made the difference? That was the test, right? That piece.
You could call it a test,
read
a
it.
test of wills. He wouldn't read it. Yeah, he wouldn't read it. And I wasn't going to argue with him.
So you're a sole anchor now.
Yeah, yeah. Now, let me tell you, I don't...
Put that on a tape, so how we stop.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay, this is a good place.
This is good because we're just